I told you that Richard Nixon was a realist in foreign affairs. I could have told you that he was a believer in Brands's fourth law of history, the one that says that sooner or later countries get the foreign policies they can afford. I could have told you that, but it wouldn't have really made sense because Brands's fourth law had not yet been invented. But he certainly believed in the principle. In fact, Brands's fourth law is a statement of a part of the realists' approach to international affairs, which is that you got to have the power in order to have your way in foreign affairs. Look at who's got the power, and power includes economic power. Anyway, but Nixon was a realist, and he understood that sooner or later countries get the foreign policies they can afford. So part of his reason for engaging in détente, for winding things down with the Soviet Union, de-tensifying détente, and putting a lid on the arms race and saying no to a race in defensive weapons, was to save some money. I should say just a little bit more about basically banning anti-missile systems. In 1969, 1970, 1971, when all this stuff was being thought out, there were effectively no effective defensive systems against intercontinental missiles. There were defensive systems against bombers, there were fighter planes, and there were anti-aircraft missiles you could fire from the ground. But the intercontinental missiles, there was just no way that was at all reliable to shoot them down, because when launched they went up out of the atmosphere, they went up into outer space, and they came zooming down at 15 or 20,000 miles an hour, basically too fast to shoot them down. And so each side had the offensive capability to take out the other side, to destroy, to annihilate the other side with its nuclear weapons. Neither side had the ability to defend against that first strike. And there was a certain appeal to leaving it that way, because especially in the nuclear age, what one side saw as a defensive system, the other side could see as threatening, could see almost as an offensive system. Imagine a world in which both sides have the capacity to destroy the other. The term of art for it was mutual assured destruction, MAD. It seemed an apt acronym for what many saw as the irrational philosophy on which the world had rested its defense against nuclear war, but MAD. So imagine a system in which both sides have this capability, but one side, maybe secretly, or very swiftly develops the capacity to defend itself against the other side's attack. All of a sudden, an asymmetry develops between the two sides. So now side A, the one that has the defensive system, knows that it can threaten to annihilate the other side, and it is not threatened in return. And so it upsets this balance, what some people call the balance of terror, balance of nuclear power, but the balance of terror, each side being vulnerable to the other. And now suppose that you are the leadership of country B, the one that doesn't have the defensive system, and you catch wind that the other side is developing a defensive system. What are you going to do? Well, you certainly would be tempted, at least, to think about launching before the other side gets its defensive system in place. So even the building of a defensive system could be destabilizing. So there was, on top of this philosophy, where there was the understanding that if one side starts developing defensive systems, the other side is going to have to respond, and both sides will wind up spending billions and billions of dollars, and in the end will be no more secure than they are right now. So this was the thinking behind, let's ban anti-ballistic missile systems. And so the two treaties that the treaty that came out of Nixon's meeting with Brezhnev in Moscow was the SALT Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitations Talks originally, and then Treaty. And as part of the original SALT, later called SALT I, was this ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, that said neither side is going to develop anti-ballistic missile systems. There was a loophole. Each side could have one defensive system around either a missile field or the national capital, but they couldn't build comprehensive defensive systems. And this was a really important part of the détente agreement between the United States and Soviet Union. But anyway, Nixon undertook this in part because he knew that the United States no longer had the capacity to afford what it had afforded 25 years earlier. So we're now 25 years, we're in 1971, 72. So we're basically 25 years into the Cold War. I mentioned in an earlier talk that in 1945, the United States stood way atop the pyramid of world economic power. And it had half the whole world's industrial product that was American. By the early 1970s, that proportion has gone down. The absolute size of America's economy had gone up, but the economies of other countries had gone up even more. So the United States no longer could afford the ambitious foreign policies that it had adopted in 1945, in particular in the realm of international monetary policy and international finance. As I mentioned in an earlier time, in 1945, 1944 and 1945, the United States established this system of international money, of international finance, that was based on the American dollar. So the dollar would be the linchpin of world currencies. And the dollar itself would be based on gold, which was something was reassuring to a lot of people. So the United States simply wouldn't just go crazy printing up new dollar bills, because the United States promised to redeem US dollars in gold. And there was a limited supply of gold. And the going rate was $35 per an ounce of gold. So an ounce of gold would buy $35. So the United States had to be careful that there weren't more claims on its gold supply in dollars. So there weren't more dollars being held by foreign countries than the United States had gold to back up those claims. Because if those countries started getting nervous about America's ability to honor its claims, if, for example, the United States government started printing dollars, and the world knew what happened when governments started printing dollars. The nightmare of people who worried about governments printing too many dollars was Germany in the 1920s, where the German government just printed German marks, the German currency, by the millions and then the billions, until each mark was worth a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a penny. The currency became effectively worthless. And this is what happens when inflation gets out of control. So this was the whole idea of pinning other currencies to the dollar and pinning the dollar to gold. The trouble was that by the early 1970s, there were more dollars in foreign hands than, first of all, foreigners wanted to have. They were worried that there were simply too many dollars around and the dollar was going to be worth less. There's a fundamental law of economics, law of supply and demand. And the larger the supply of something, the lower the price that it can command. And so if people had more dollars than they wanted, they'd get worried and they would insist on converting those dollars to gold, until the United States got to the point where it looked as though soon it would not be able to honor that promise that went all the way back to the so-called Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, that the U.S. would redeem dollars at the rate of $35 per ounce of gold. The United States simply didn't have enough gold to cover all of those implicit promises. So something had to give. One more time, this is a demonstration of the fact that the world economy in the early 1970s is not the same thing as the world economy in 1944 and 1945. And I'd mentioned at that earlier time that the United States had an exaggerated position at that point because its two of its principal industrial competitors, Japan and Germany, had been wiped out by the war. And everybody knew that they would make a comeback, and they did. Both Germany and Japan came back strongly in the 1950s and even more in the 1960s. So by the early 1970s, they were these powerhouses, and Americans were buying lots of German goods, Volkswagens and the like. They were buying lots of Japanese goods, electronics, and eventually Japanese cars, which meant that dollars were going out of the United States to these foreign countries. And these foreign countries, they had more dollars than they wanted, so they started to redeem them in gold. And this put the strain on the Bretton Woods Agreement until it got to the point where in 1971, Nixon had to announce a change. The United States could no longer afford to honor this agreement. The United States, first of all, the term was closing the gold window. The United States was no longer accepting dollars held by foreigners to redeem at the price $35 per ounce of gold. I should add here that the United States had long refused to honor Americans' domestic claims on gold. So the U.S. went off the gold standard domestically in the 1930s. The U.S. was on the gold standard internationally from the 1940s to to 1971. In 1971, Nixon said, sorry, we're done. We can't do this anymore. And this really shocked the world financial system, which for 25 years had been based on the primacy of the dollar and the sort of rock solidity of the dollar. But now that thing is just wobbling and floating. In fact, the term was the U.S. went from a dollar that was fixed to gold to a floating dollar. So the U.S. dollar began to float up and down in value compared to other currencies. In other currencies, they cut their ties to the dollar because they had fixed rates. And the world went to floating rates, which meant that, well, so how many British pounds how many dollars does it take to buy a British pound? Because the pound is worth more than a dollar. How many dollars does it take to buy a British pound? Well, that depends. It depends on what the price is today. So the price of currencies one against the other went up and down, like the price of cotton and like the price of wheat and like the price of shares in corporations and like the price of anything else. And it was governed by supply and demand. So that if people had more dollars than they wanted, then the price of the dollar would go down compared to other currencies. If people had fewer dollars, if they wanted dollars all of a sudden, then the price of the dollar compared to other currencies would go up. But this is the system we have been on, the world has been on, ever since the early 1970s. This system where if you want to know how much a dollar is worth compared to other currencies, if you're going traveling, if you stop at the airport on your leaving, or when you get to the airport at the other end and you want to know how many if you're exchanging your dollars for the local currency, euros or yen or whatever it might be, you have to look and see what the going rate is. It won't be fixed. It had been fixed for 25 years, but now it's floating just like everything else. So that by itself indicated that the world had changed. And that was one of the contributors to Nixon's detente, because he's trying to figure out how to cut back on American spending and a lot of the spending had to do with the arms race. A lot of the spending had to do with the war in Vietnam. I mentioned that one of Nixon's goals in detente was to get the Chinese to stop supplying the North Vietnamese. He tried to pull the same thing on the Soviets, to get them to pull back their support for North Vietnam. And his hope was if he could get the Soviets and the Chinese to stop backing North Vietnam, then he would pull American troops out of Vietnam, and North Vietnam and South Vietnam would remain in, well, peaceful coexistence, like the peaceful coexistence was the basis of detente. The Soviets and the Chinese wouldn't go that far. They had their own credibility issues, and they had been supplying Ho Chi Minh, and they weren't about to stop. And Nixon, by the way, didn't propose that the U.S. would stop supplying South Vietnam. So Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese, the Vietnamese communists, were on the verge of victory in Vietnam anyway. And so his communist sponsors, the Soviet Union and China, weren't about to say, no, you can't go ahead with this. Nixon realized that was more than he was going to get out of this deal, so he basically accepted that part. So one goal of detente was to end the Vietnam War without the defeat of South Vietnam. It failed. And in fact, as I explained in the talk on Vietnam, there was a peace accord. Nixon pulled the American troops out. The United States still proposed to support the government of South Vietnam, but then Nixon got tangled up in Watergate, and by the time that thing was done, Americans had had enough of Vietnam. They say, forget it, we're just writing Vietnam off, and the war in Vietnam ended badly for the South Vietnamese and for the United States. So this was one of the things that detente did not accomplish. Now I'm coming to what detente didn't do and why it was criticized. Detente was criticized by conservatives in the United States from the start. And Nixon was seen as a fairly liberal Republican president, certainly in the field of foreign affairs, because he believed in peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence with the communists? We can't do that. We're anti-communist. But Nixon proposed to do this. And there were groups in the United States that didn't like an end to the arms race. So arms manufacturers in the United States, they made money on building weapons. And whatever stopped the arms race was a threat to their profits. Now, they didn't put it in quite those terms. They didn't say, we want more profits, therefore we need to build more weapons. What they do is they made the argument that the Soviets are cheating on these limits and we can't detect them because they have a closed society. So in fact, the Soviet Unions continue to build, and we're the only ones who are obeying the limitations. There was some truth to this, less truth than they made out, but there was some truth to it. So people who opposed détente for personal reasons, if you're an arms manufacturer, if you are a political opponent of Richard Nixon, you can find reasons, plausible sort of disinterested reasons for making the case against détente. At times, the Soviets didn't make it easy to support détente. The Soviets interpret détente as, okay, we're not going to try to take over the United States anymore. But they did not read it as, we're going to give up on supporting communist movements around the world, any more than the United States said, we're going to stop supporting our allies around the world. So the Soviet Union continued to support communist insurgencies in places like Central America and Central Africa. And this made it easy for the opponents of détente, who, for the various reasons I mentioned, they said détente is a bad deal for the United States, and they say, see, this is even more of a bad deal, because it allows the Soviet Union to continue to undermine democracy and the United States against the basic principle of détente. So détente was this thing that it was hard for a lot of people to really warm up to. You couldn't get excited about détente. The best thing you could say was, it's better than what went before, which in many ways was true. But it wasn't something that got people excited. And every time the Soviet Union did something that seemed annoying, that didn't seem right in America's direct interest, the critics of détente would howl loud and long. The fact that it was during the period of détente that the United States and the South Vietnamese finally lost the war in Vietnam. That was one that was chalked up against détente. Boy, if Nixon had still been staunchly anti-communist, if the United States had not embarked on that policy of détente, South Vietnam would not be communist. It wouldn't have been taken over by the communists. So they could say, South Vietnam was lost to communism under détente. Another black mark against détente. Richard Nixon was forced to resign the presidency in the summer of 1974. He was succeeded by his vice president, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was a good, solid, moderate Republican. He'd had a career in Congress and a good guy and a steadying force. But Gerald Ford was never a force in politics, in part because he did something just about a month after becoming president that hung over his head. And that was he pardoned Richard Nixon. Now, this doesn't have anything directly to do, I should say. It didn't come out of foreign policy, but it had a consequence for foreign policy because a lot of people who still disliked, distrusted, and despised Richard Nixon thought that there must have been a backroom bargain here, that Nixon made a deal with Ford whereby Nixon will resign, Ford becomes president. What politician does not want to become president? But once Ford is president, then Ford will pardon Richard Nixon, so Richard Nixon won't have to go to jail for any of the Watergate crimes. Boy, that sounds like a sweet deal, a sweetheart insider deal. That's certainly what it sounded like and to what many people it looked like. It almost certainly is not true in any formal way. It's almost certainly the case that Gerald Ford did not sign anything or did not explicitly say to Richard Nixon, okay, you leave office and I will pardon you. But it's also true that Nixon sounded out Gerald Ford, not directly himself. He would have seen, so what do you think Ford would think of a pardon? Now, when Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, the way he put it was, this country has been laboring under this scandal of Watergate for years. This is, well, not really years. So Watergate first starts to surface in 1973, and this is now late 1974. But anyway, He imagines that this is going to go on and on. If there was a court case, if there was an indictment, a prosecution, a trial of Richard Nixon, this certainly could go on for a long time. And Ford said the country simply can't afford it. We need to get past this. And whatever Richard Nixon did, it didn't include murder or anything like that. It was fiddling with politics, which might be a crime against democracy, but it's not exactly a crime against humanity. So Ford very easily could, and I'm sure he did, in his own mind, justify the pardon of Richard Nixon as being good for the country. We need to get on with the problems the country is facing. Domestic problems, foreign affairs problems. We need to deal with this. And so by pardoning Richard Nixon, we put an end to the trial, to this long national nightmare, and the country gets to move ahead. And from what I know of Gerald Ford, I think he was probably sincere in this. But it was easy for people who didn't like Nixon to then extrapolate their dislike of Nixon to Jerry Ford, and it meant that Gerald Ford was going to lose the election of 1976. He ran for election in his own right, not re-election. He was the incumbent but hadn't been elected. So he was going to run for election in 1976. And he lost a close race. And he might have won without that pardon of Richard Nixon hanging over his head. If you wanted to interpret it charitably toward Gerald Ford, you could say that Ford, he knew that this was going to be controversial. Ford basically put his political future on the line in doing something that he thought the country needed to have done. So you could mark it as a bold, a courageous move, a selfless move by Gerald Ford. Okay, not everybody interpreted it that way, and enough interpreted it the other way, so that Gerald Ford loses in 1976 to Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter was elected. He got the Democratic nomination in 1976, and he won the election largely on the basis of having been nowhere near Washington during the Watergate scandal, nowhere near Washington at the time of the sad ending of the war in Vietnam. So the two things that Americans sort of most regretted about government affairs of the last few years were domestically Watergate and the loss in Vietnam. And Jimmy Carter had been governor of Georgia, but he hadn't been a member of the federal government. And so he has sort of a good excuse. You can't blame that stuff on me. But he also had a very different approach to world affairs. And Jimmy Carter was the anti-Nixon when it came to foreign affairs. If Nixon was a realist, one who says, don't bother me with values, don't bother me with nebulous idealism. No, just tell me, well, to quote Joseph Stalin, who in a conversation with Winston Churchill during World War II, Stalin was going to take a measure that Churchill thought would be controversial with Catholics around the world. And Stalin, according to this story, is supposed to have said, well, tell me, how many divisions, military divisions, how many divisions does the Pope have? So Stalin, if that remark is true, and certainly Stalin had this overall approach, whether he said those words or not, Stalin had the view that don't bother me with values. I don't care what the Pope thinks. If he doesn't have an army, then I don't have to worry about what he thinks. So that's the hardcore of realism. That's what Richard Nixon was all about. Jimmy Carter was one who believed in idealism. He believed in ideals. He believed in the liberal mission of the United States. Now, liberal here, I have to be clear. In American politics in 2020, liberal is usually thought of in domestic terms, and it means a comfort level with larger government domestically. And by contrast, a conservative is one who is skeptical of larger government domestically. But there's a broader term, and in the field of international relations, liberal means honoring sort of the values of liberty and human rights and human values. And it originated back in the 18th and 19th century when the people who were being liberated from the oppressive authority of government, basically the government of kings and queens and empresses and czarinas and the like. So the liberal views in international affairs are shrink the role of government, especially oppressive governments, let people have the freedom to exercise their liberties. Anyway, so Carter is a believer, Carter was a believer, Carter is a believer in ideals, in values, that what the United States should stand for was the values of democracy, of individual liberties, of human rights. And especially after 15, 20 years of 25 years maybe, of trying to defeat communism in Southeast Asia, Carter says it's about time for a change. We fought that war in Vietnam, believing that the way to fight fire, as he put it, was with fire, the fire of communism, with the fire of American military power. And that's not right. That's not productive. Hey, look, we tried it. We spent a lot of money. We lost 60,000 plus American lives, and it didn't work. It's time to try something else. And so Carter emphasized just the opposite of Nixon's philosophy of realism. Carter put in place a foreign policy based on idealism, based on human rights. And human rights applied in the United States, of course. The United States observed their rights. And Carter, a Southern Democrat, now lived at a time beyond the era of Jim Crow. So in the United States, people had civil rights. In fact, so within a given country, especially in a democratic country, human rights are usually identified as civil rights, your rights as a citizen. But the term human rights applies all around the world, even in countries where people are not, strictly speaking, called citizens. But it was the idea of equality, equal rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, all this stuff that Americans hold dear in their own lives and in their own country. And Carter said, this is what we ought to be promoting. We should not support regimes simply because they are the enemy of our enemies. We ought to support regimes that support our values as well. And so Carter made a big deal out of this human rights-based, idealism-based foreign policy, to the extent that when insurgencies arose in countries that had been allies of the United States against the regimes of those countries and threatened to destabilize those countries, Carter said, well, maybe those regimes deserve to be destabilized. Ever since the Monroe Doctrine, ever since the Truman Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine of 1947, where Harry Truman had said the United States would go to the aid of friendly regimes that were threatened by internal subversion or external force. The thinking had been that a regime that we're aiding doesn't have to be perfect as long as it's anti-communist. And Carter said that's not enough. The regimes that we're going to go to the aid of, they have to be regimes that share our values. And so when an insurgency developed in Nicaragua against an autocratic regime there that for years had been supported by the United States, Carter stood back. And he said, okay, maybe the regime needs to be overthrown, and we'll just let this insurgency play out and let's see how it goes. But the United States should not fall into that trap we've fallen into again and again of supporting a regime simply because the opposition looks like it might be friendly to enemies of the United States. And there were leftists, there were communists in the anti-government regime in Nicaragua. I'm going to say more on this when I'm talking about Central America. But Carter said, just let it happen. When an insurgency, when demonstrations developed against the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran, the ruler of Iran, basically the king of Iran, had been in power since the early 1950s. He had been booted out briefly and then restored largely with the support of the United States and Britain in 1953. So he had been an ally of the United States. He'd been a fractious ally, at times not particularly cooperative, but basically somebody that the United States could more or less rely on. But he became increasingly loathed by people in Iran. And so a big movement emerged to overthrow the Shah of Iran. And there again, Carter says, okay, if the guy can't win the support of the people of Iran, then maybe he doesn't deserve to be in power. Maybe the United States should get on the side of change instead of the side of opposition to change. And so Carter found himself confronted with these regimes in Nicaragua and Iran that in fact collapsed in the second half of his administration. And those people who had been criticizing détente, they said, oh my God, this is exactly what détente leads to. unless the United States has the force and the willingness to use it, then all of our friends around the world are going to doubt our credibility. Okay, our friends aren't all perfect, but they're better than the communists. They're better than the regimes that are going to replace them. And so we need to just open our eyes. We need to be realistic about that. Interestingly, that they took a page from Richard Nixon, who by this time they were despising. He was in discredited retirement. Nonetheless, they liked Nixon more than they liked Carter. But they didn't like Carter. And basically, they didn't like Detente. They wanted to go back, they really wanted to go back to the old Cold War, because Detente was essentially a truce in the Cold War, a truce in the sort of the values part of the Cold War. And so they didn't like it. But Carter still defended it until in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Now, I'm going to explain this when I talk about the Middle East. But this is one where Carter admitted that he had been taken by surprise. He underestimated what the Soviet Union might be up to. And at that moment, upon the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Detente basically breathed its last. More on what came after that later.